All right, and we are live on YouTube, and I'm going to let everybody in. All right. Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We've just gotten started, so welcome. It takes a few minutes to let everybody in. Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We're just getting started. It takes a couple of minutes to let everybody in the door. But if you're looking for the Renters Alliance Town Hall, you found it. If you've just joined us, this is the Renters Alliance Renter Town Hall. We are just getting started. It takes a couple minutes to let everybody in the door. And I hope you can hear us. If you can't, it's because your computer's microphone's not on. Okay, we've hit our magic number. Good evening, everyone. This is Matt Losak. I'm the co-founder, executive director of the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. Tonight, we're going to be discussing the issues of opposition to rent stabilization. And a little bit later in our discussion, we'll be joined by State Senator Shelley Hettleman from Baltimore, who is the lead sponsor on Senate Bill 100. Which now, when it's signed by the governor, will require landlords to be licensed before they can take a tenant to court to evict them, which is seems common sense, but it used to be no matter how bad an actor you were, you could take your tenant to court, even though you hadn't made any repairs or taken care of the mold or done any of the things that you're supposed to do as a licensed landlord. That is about to change. But that will be probably around after 8 o'clock. And we're also joined by county officials, Nicole Catravanos, from manager of the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, and I believe her colleague from Code Enforcement. In addition, we have our staff, Malek Demir, David Mullins, and Pat Beckham. And I have my two board members who are keeping me honest, Josh Fisher, our treasurer, who makes sure the money is spent the right way, and the vice chair of our board, Chris Perry, who is also here monitoring the conversation and gives us pointers when it's all over to say what we should have said, what I should have said better. So thank you for all of you joining. Now, a couple of the rules. If you have a question or concern, we'd like you to put it in the chat. That's what staff will be monitoring, and we will try to get to all of those questions and concerns a little bit later. Couple status check things. We are, the Renters Alliance is monitoring the considerations of the council for the two rent stabilization bills that are before them now. One of the bills is called the Anti-Rent Gouge Bill. That was co-sponsored by Council Member Andrew Friedson and Natalie Fanny Gonzalez. That bill would limit rents to 12.4%. and would exempt small landlords from that protection, but has some other provisions in it, including more money for building rental housing and for education and outreach. The other bill, called the Home Act, co-sponsored by Council Member Will Jawando and Council Member Kristen Mink, would limit rents at 3%, would require all landlords to abide by those rules. But both bills also exempt new construction. So anybody who wanted to invest in development in a new multifamily housing would not be stabilized in order that they get back their initial investment and make a profit. So there's no reason for either bill to dissuade anybody from new investment. Obviously, the Renters Alliance is much more aligned with a bill that restricts rents more severely at 3%. We think that's better. But the council is deliberating, and it seems that there are issues with both bills. And so as part of this public dialogue, we're keeping this conversation going. We had a community meeting in downtown Silver Spring. We've testified before the council. Our board chair, William Roberts, testified. I testified, as many of the renters in the Renters Alliance community have testified, as well as scores, literally, organizations across Montgomery County, most very much in support of the Home Act. So tonight is another opportunity to have this dialogue, and we are very grateful to have with us Adjunct Professor Michael Bodakin, who is an adjunct professor with the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. A couple other highlights, which I think people should know about Mr. Bodakin, is that he's the former deputy mayor of the city of Los Angeles. That's not small potatoes. And he was also president of the Housing Trust, if I've got that right, a past president in any case, and is a housing expert, housing policy expert. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Michael Bodakin. Michael.
Thanks, Matt. And as you mentioned, I do have a past. I'm here in my personal capacity, but I did serve as a deputy mayor of housing or housing coordinator for the city of Los Angeles, and I served as head of the National Housing Trust, where we developed over 3,000 apartments during my tenure. And I do currently serve as an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. I thought it might be useful to spend about 15 minutes going over the points that opponents of rent stabilization make and trying to reasonably answer those questions. Matt began this by talking about housing investment. There's a canard out there that rent regulation leads to housing disinvestment. The short answer to that is, as long as you exempt new construction, and these bills do that, there's no impact on investment. And the best evidence of that is the booming real estate markets in many cities that have adopted rent stabilization: Los Angeles, Boston, Washington, D.C., New York, and elsewhere. Indeed, in the last 50 years, Washington, D.C. ranks second out of the 98 nationwide markets in multifamily development activity. In 2021, nearly 26,000 new development units are projected to be completed in Washington, D.C. That's not a sign of a weak market. The same is true if you go across the country to the Bay Area. They studied 6 cities in the Bay Area. They found absolutely no impact on rent stabilization. And indeed, in Massachusetts, they found that new construction, and this is probably pretty basic, is much more affected by interest rates. It's much more affected by market conditions. So when you have a depression in a local economy, real estate activity declines. But that has nothing to do with whether or not there's a rent stabilization ordinance. It has to do with much bigger and more important economic factors. And I believe in a larger, vibrant metropolitan area such as Montgomery County, a rent regulation is certainly warranted. Finally, just in New Jersey, many multiple longitudinal studies compared different municipalities all over New Jersey over a decade, and they found no relationship between rent regulation and new housing construction. So then on the other hand, what is the benefit economically for rent stabilization? And this is very strange. None of the studies really talk about the benefit to tenants and to the municipalities for the people who benefit from rent stabilization. So if you think about it, the money that rent stabilization moderates are rents. And that money is either going to the landlord or the tenant. It doesn't disappear. And so what's going to happen with that money is it's going to stay in the economy. Either the landlord's going to spend it or the tenant's going to spend it, but it doesn't disappear. The other thing to think about is the impact on rent stabilization in terms of stable housing for the people who live in that housing. What we know about the promotion of home ownership in our society is that housing stability is highly correlated with physical, social, and psychological well-being, higher educational achievement, and benefits for people of color. All of those same things are true of rent stabilization. All of them have positive economic benefits for the people who live there and for the municipalities, because the municipalities are no longer providing extra help for the kids who are moving from school to school. They're not providing extra health care or mental health care for the people who are stressed out because they can't afford housing. They're not basically trying to rob Peter to pay Paul to make sure that the tenants have affordable housing because they're stable and they don't have to worry about that. The other thing that is probably worth noting, and again is not brought up in the economic studies, is it disproportionately benefits people who need housing most. Low-income seniors, people of color, women-headed households are disproportionately benefit from rent stabilization by definition because they have the lowest incomes and pay the most for housing. So any regulation that regulates what they have to pay for housing benefits them disproportionately. Another argument that is sometimes put forward is, doesn't rent stabilization lead to lower maintenance and poor housing conditions? And indeed, there are studies that seem to show that there is some correlation between rent stabilization and lack of maintenance, but only in cities that have poor health codes. So in New York City, when they beefed up the health code, they had rent stabilization. All of a sudden, poor housing conditions were mitigated. The same would be true of Montgomery County, that has a strong health code. And so there's no indication that there is a correlation. And indeed, again, a study of the repeal of rent regulations in Massachusetts showed that maintenance both before, during rent stabilization, and after rent stabilization had no real particular effect on maintenance. And finally, in DC, the same is true. If you take a look at housing code violations before rent stabilization and after rent stabilization, there's no meaningful difference. There's all kinds of anecdotal people talking about rent stabilization leading to poor housing quality. If you just take a look at the facts, housing violations in DC are about the same, both before and after rent stabilization. Now, to be fair, some of the concerns about rent stabilization are people saying, you know, why don't we just build more housing? Won't that take care of this issue? Because the housing supply will increase and we'll have more housing, and that means we'll meet the demand. We don't need rent stabilization. So in economics, there's this notion of what's called the filtering effect, right? And what we look at is what is the need for housing and what are the rents that people can afford who need housing. And generally speaking, in this area, the rents that people who need housing can afford are between $500 and $800 a month. That's what they can afford. Well, the housing that's being built doesn't rent that cheaply. The housing that's being built has $1,200 rents, $1,500 rents, $2,000 rents. So there's no real filtering down of that housing to meet the actual need. It meets a need for higher income people and should be done. But just building more housing for market rate doesn't help us deal with the fact that we are losing affordable housing, and the housing we need to be affordable is not being built unless it's massively subsidized by the federal or state and local government. So those are some of the issues that have been brought up. Again, I'll just repeat, there's no significant impact at all on housing investment. There is a strong correlation for positive economic activity for the tenants who live there in the municipalities where this occurs. There is no indication of any correlation between rent stabilization and lousy housing conditions. In fact, there's just no indication of that in terms of the data. And finally, I think we should build more housing. We need to build more housing, but that doesn't deal with the stubborn problem we have of people who can't afford housing, who are healthcare workers, nurses, police officers, other people who need housing. We have to have housing that those working people can afford, and that housing needs to be rent regulated so they can be stable and live there happily.
So, Mr. Bodakin, if I could just pepper you with some questions and probably make you repeat yourself in a different way. For example, we hear often in the arguments against that, they say, well, look at Tacoma Park, nobody builds there. Or look at St. Paul, Minnesota, that had this big downturn. Or in Oregon, they had this big downturn. Are these valid examples?
Well, they're examples. They're not valid examples. They are for each one of those. I mean, facts are stubborn things, Matt. The problem with all of those examples is they don't apply to. We have a county of over 1 million people, 500 square miles. I don't think Tacoma Park is a good proxy for what's going on in the economic activity of Montgomery County. In fact, I think it's the opposite. Tacoma Park is probably an exceptionally different kind of place, and it just happens to be in Montgomery County, but it is not representative of Montgomery County. Montgomery County is vast, and it has all kinds of economic activity that, and is not, I mean, and of course, Tacoma Park is landlocked. There's no possible way to build anything having to do, unless you build it up. So it has much more to do with zoning and other issues in Tacoma Park. But I find that, when people ask me that question, I always feel like Tacoma Park is hardly representative, and yet it's never been representative before. Now the landlords are saying Tacoma Park is representative. When's the last time a landlord said Tacoma Park, we all ought to be like Tacoma Park, or should not be like Tacoma Park? Is just on one fringe of what part of Montgomery County. We live in a metropolitan area with many municipalities and many neighborhoods, and it's hardly representative. In terms of St. Paul, it is true that St. Paul passed an ordinance that did not exempt new construction, and immediately it dampened investment. And guess what? They immediately changed the law. And in fact, they're going to go back and make a law that is almost identical to the one that the Home Act proposes. And so the landlords in St. Paul are not going to oppose that law. In Oregon, the economic activity after rent regulation had a lot more to do with business investment in Oregon. And there's no indication, as I said, I want to make sure the real proxy for Montgomery County is Washington, D.C. We have a city of about 1 million, actually less than we have, about 700,000 or 800,000 right next to us. This has rent stabilization for years and has had extraordinary growth, second out in the United States with rent stabilization. So I find it that much more of a comparison. If once Washington, D.C. starts losing its economic might, then we can have a discussion.
One of the other, to reverse the analysis a little bit, you talked about how valuable rent stabilization is for individual and family participation in the economic, political, and social life of their communities, the stronger success, academic success of children in our schools when they live in stable homes. Could we examine that backwards and say, what is the cost of not doing rent stabilization?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has a number of studies that demonstrate the emergency room costs of what's going on in emergency rooms in cities, and what is a constant factor. People who are going to the ER are people who are inadequately sheltered or who pay too much and haven't been able to pay for their health care. So I'll say that again. People who go to emergency rooms disproportionately are ill-housed or unaffordably housed. And that makes sense if you think about it. They're either living in lousy conditions or they're paying so much for rent that they can't pay for their health care. That leads to more emergency room visits. And indeed, University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, Kaiser, other medical, Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus are investing now in housing around their hospitals to reduce the number of emergency room visits they see from chronic emergency room users. And we're beginning to see a net return for those hospitals for this investment. So there are millions and millions of dollars that we're squandering in the public for particularly healthcare, also education. When kids move frequently, they need more help in our public schools. There's every study after study, frequent movers, kids have problems in schools. Those kids need more help. That means they have to be trained by professionals. We have to pay those professionals to go in, spend extra time with those kids. You and I pay for that. People who have stable housing don't have as many problems in school. And indeed, the night I testified, I don't know, about a month ago in Montgomery County, this young woman talked about the value. She'd been a frequent mover, but she'd been stably housed for 5 years. Her grades went up. She was much more civically involved. And that is a good thing for our county. That woman is going to be employed. That woman is going to do something in her life. And we don't have to worry about her health care. We don't have to worry about her civic engagement. So we really have to start thinking about it from a different perspective.
And she'll pay taxes.
And she'll pay taxes.
Which is a good thing for
It
those
is
of
not
us who have programs that need subsidies.
Not a bad thing.
Right. Very good. I want to address something that's coming up in the chat about, what is an affordable rent? Mr. Badakian, if you want to weigh in on that, that's fine.
Sure.
I can tell you that these bills are trying to balance a common rent increase guideline with Montgomery County. They're averaging around 3% a year based on a CPI or consumer price index for urban areas, which has traditionally been between 2 and 4% in our region. This year, because of inflation, it is extremely high. It's at 5.8%. Bear in mind, the anti-rent gouging bill, as it is called, we believe that what they're proposing is actually a gouge, but it is proposing a 12.4% rent increase. That is a lot of money. The other bill is talking about 3%. It seems both bills are going to have to come together in some way. This is a bad year for everybody. Inflation has made the price of eggs go up. I went to the Giant today to see if there was any kind of steak I could buy, and I just refused to pay for steak that costs more than going out to dinner. It's just too much. And unfortunately, housing is caught up in this. So, Mr. Badakian, if you have any sense of the numbers, what and the principle, what is the fair balance between rents and a landlord's need to make some money and keep up with overhead?
Well, let's start with the standard definition of an affordable shelter or affordable rent. And the standard definition is 30% of your gross income. That standard's been around for decades, and it's not everybody pays that. Don't get me wrong, but that's the standard definition of what we consider in our country to be affordable, whether it's home ownership or rental. From a landlord's perspective, and this is an important perspective, the landlord needs to be able to pay the following costs. They need to be able to pay insurance. They have to be able to pay taxes, maintenance. They have to pay for people to help at the property. All that operational costs, the rents have to pay for that. And then they have to have a modest return. They have to have a profit incentive. And depending on who you talk to, that has to be 8 to 10% a year over their operating expenses. Certainly they're entrepreneurs. They need to be compensated for the risk taking they are, but they shouldn't be necessarily gouging people. And I do agree with you, 12% is a gouge. I don't see how people can look at themselves in the mirror and say, that's not a gouge. I mean, they can call it what they want, but it's a gouge.
Yeah, it is. Go ahead, David.
Just on rent costs there, we did have a question earlier about, you had quote, I think people that are most in need of housing need to pay about $500 to $800 a month or something. There was just a follow-up question specifically about where that came from, that figure.
So the Joint Center for Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies publishes every year the state of the nation's housing. It's in June, I think, of every year. And they almost always talk about the filtering effect and what is needed. And that number came from last year's 2022 State of the Nation's Housing, about what the average rents or the newly constructed units are. And if you compare that to the need, you'll see it's a lot higher, that the average rents of newly constructed units are, well, twice what people who are on the lower income can pay. And that shouldn't surprise us. Land is going up, construction costs are going up. There's a lot of reasons why, in order to make a profit, people who build new apartments have to charge more. And I'm not suggesting they charge less. I'm just saying that what they're building won't meet that need.
Yeah, we try to track their reports, which among all of the colleges and universities, they're one of the better ones that track good data, along with the eviction group at Princeton.
Yep.
What else do we have, staff, from folks?
I don't see anything that he didn't already cover.
Yeah, we just kind of have some appreciative.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, everybody, facts are so relieving these days.
It does seem
They used to be threatening, but nowadays, with so much malarkey, to quote the great president, going on, that actually having people who know what they're talking about and knowing facts is very soothing.
I will say it's really important that I've heard there's some bloggers, I don't know these people, who are talking about, and it is true that classic liberal economists have always opposed rent regulation as a distortion of economic behavior. But what I have yet to see, and what I would really welcome, is a study that talks about the impact on the real estate industry and also the impact on the people who live in the units, the economic impact of the people who live in the units, the economic impact of the people who now have money for healthcare and so on. And I've never seen a study like that. I think it's hard probably to do, but I think that argument, or that point, isn't made enough, because as I mentioned, right now, that money doesn't disappear. It's either in the landlord's pocket or the tenant's pocket. It's going to be spent. It doesn't disappear. And so I think it's important for us to see what is the best use of that dollar. Mm-hmm. And in some cases, for the economic benefit of the county, it's better off in the people who would otherwise be using the county facilities for other purposes, and we would be paying for it.
I think it's also worth backing up a little bit to talk a little bit about housing and the market. We often talk about housing, or certainly the landlords and some folks talk about housing like they're talking about beer and cigarettes or sneakers or fancy pocketbooks. And, it's not the same thing. Every industry has responsibilities. Some have less responsibilities than others. If you're producing, fancy sneakers, then you can, as long as you're not, creating them with child labor or doing some other harm to society, pretty much you can sell them at whatever the market will bear. It's a luxury item, and if somebody can afford to buy it, terrific. Good luck to you. Jewelry, if you can afford to buy a diamond tiara or something, then good for you. It's not really important one way or the other. Whereas housing has a balance with society's health, welfare, and prosperity.
Right.
And while we agree that the best method for putting housing out there should be balanced with capitalism and market forces and so on, but it has to also be balanced with community health, welfare, and housing stability. And so that's sort of why public policy weighs in on this discussion, as it more so than something that is entirely subject to market forces, because there's less of a social or societal interest in that commodity. In the extreme, you might say, look at utilities. Would we allow a corporation or an individual to come in and buy up all the land around our reservoir and say, you know what, we're going to charge you $1,000 a gallon now because we own it?
Mhm.
We would never allow it. So there we would say, hey, look, housing, while not entirely a utility, has some responsibilities like a utility that profit making has to be balanced with. So that's part of the discussion. The other thing that often comes up, and this is all due respect to our landlord friends who are listening to this and making arguments, that rent is not just about covering overhead. We expect a landlord who charges rent to also charge a rent that includes overhead, materials expenses, labor expenses, and a profit. And to also plan that rent so that it's, not just this day or this week or this year, but, you need to also look at where things are going. And so when you start to sell something, is this going to be a profit margin that makes you a return that you can live with? And so, we're not looking at limiting a land, certainly not the Renters Alliance position. We put this in writing to the council and the executive. We haven't picked a number for the increase. Well, obviously, we prefer a more restrictive one. But our principle is what we put forward, which is that we believe a landlord has a right to maintain his or her profit, and keep up with legitimate direct expenses. We understand that. We don't think that, you're in the charity business. We get it. But at the same time, you have some responsibilities too, and you can't just make as much money as the market will bear without any responsibility for the individuals or the families that live in your homes. These are not hotel rooms, they're not Airbnbs, these are people's homes. So oftentimes we'll hear a landlord say, as we saw in the chat, what about all these expenses? Well, you should be planning your rent to include for these expenses. And inflation is damaging everybody, but it can't be an excuse not to have responsibility for stable, affordable.
It's probably worth mentioning, Matt, that both bills allow a landlord who has extraordinary operating expenses to come in to demonstrate that they have extraordinary operating expenses and get a higher rent. Both bills.
I think that's extremely important. Thank you.
Yeah. I just want to make sure. I am not looking at the chat, but I will just say quickly, and I want to make sure if landlords are concerned about that, which I can understand their concern, both bills allow for, and by the way, almost every rent stabilization ordinance in the United States does this, allows for extraordinary circumstances over and above average operating costs to come in and get rent hikes. And it's not unusual to get a rent for a landlord to do that and to receive permission to have a higher rent if they demonstrate extraordinary expenses. And so I want to make sure. And the other thing I want to be crystal clear about, and maybe if I'm not, I hope so. I absolutely believe in the private real estate market. I ran an organization, a nonprofit, but we dealt with private real estate for 25 years and developed 23,000 apartments. I'm not opposed to making a profit. I am opposed to those who say they can't make a profit with rent stabilization. That has not been my experience. And again, in Washington, D.C., I think they had a 10-year high of transactions, multifamily transactions in 2021. And they built 26,000 new multifamily units in between June 2022 and this in June of 2023. That's the average rental price of those new units, which are exempt from rent control, is almost $1,900 a unit. So I don't find it compelling when people say they can't make a profit. Either you're going to build new construction and you're exempt, or you're under the old regime and you can make a profit over and above your operating expenses.
You know, one of the things that County Executive Mark Elrich always tells people when they say, you know, if you regulate us or create laws that protect renters and over-regulate the market or stabilize rents or whatever, that, you know, we won't see economic activity in terms of building multifamily housing and so on. And then, as you have done, Mr. Badakin pointed out that, you know, these highly regulated regions like Washington, D.C., like San Francisco, like Los Angeles, like New York City, you know, have strong renter protections, long-standing renter protections, including just cause and rent stabilization and code enforcement, and other operations that really look at with great displeasure seeing people destabilized. And then you go to places in the country like Cleveland or Richmond or Baltimore, or Baltimore less so now that we've got Senator Shelley Hellerman, who'll be joining us later, leading the charge. But there are places in this country with very few renter protections. And they have no economic activity in terms of building multifamily housing. In fact, they have decay and boarded up housing. And, you know, so one thing may have nothing to do with the other.
Right. Yeah, again, there's no, I keep saying this, new construction is exempt from all rent stabilization ordinances that I know about that have succeeded. And there's been no discernible impact on housing investment overall. And for landlords who are working under those systems, there's been no indication that they're willing to leave the system or go to someplace else. And it's largely because of the economic activity that's going on in those places. That is the overwhelming important factor you have to keep in mind. This is just one regulation that exists in a much more a broad, rich place with lots of different actors, and lots of interest rates are far more important to real estate economic activity than rent stabilization.
All right. Is there anything else for Mr. Badakin, folks?
We've got a couple specific questions about a couple of the bills, but specifically to what you were saying earlier, though, about filtering, though, we did have one follow-up on filtering.
Okay.
And the person was wondering really what I think they were wondering if it's something about timing, like eventually would filtering work? Is it that it doesn't work?
Yeah, that's fine. I think I know, I haven't seen the chat, but I think there is a very modest effect over time from the filtering of these units. It takes time. I think New York City found, I think rents decreased like by 0.4% or some very modest amount from a new construction that occurs. But it is important to recognize that by far all the units in DC that I just talked about, most of the units in New York that are being built are not covering or filtering down within any kind of time frame to $500 to $800 a month. That is not happening. That literally would take decades.
Mr. Badakin, could you just define what you mean by filtering?
Sure, I'm sorry. So there's a notion, it's a basic economic notion that if you flood any kind of market with any kind of commodity, the commodity's price will go down and it will filter down correspondingly. So if I flood the market with classic Picasso paintings, at some point the price of Picasso paintings will go down. And that is generally true of things like Picasso paintings because they are so rare. It is not the case. Filtering doesn't particularly work with a commodity like housing, where the cost of its development is so much higher than the need. Unlike Picasso paintings, you don't need a Picasso painting to live, right? You need housing. Everyone needs shelter. It is a human need. And those kinds of human needs tend not to respond to a vast amount of new supply going into the market, because especially where the cost of providing those materials, the new materials into the market, is higher than people can afford. And that's what filtering works, where people can afford the new commodity that's being introduced to the market, the filtering down of the commodity to make it affordable to more people. It doesn't work where the cost of providing that commodity is higher than what people can afford.
I'm a little confused by that, but one of the principles I think I understand, and we've always known this, is that demand in this area for housing is so high
Yeah,
that we are never going to see, or not likely to ever see, enough housing be built to
yeah.
flood the market and bring prices down. That's kind of a fallacy.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, I'm sorry if I'm not making the point, but the problem is Michael and Matt decide they want to build housing in Montgomery County. The cost of building housing, new housing in Montgomery County, requires us to charge rents to make our investment back at least $1,200 to $1,500 a unit. And if you look at all the new units that are coming into Montgomery County, that's going to be the cost for Matt and Mike to build their housing. And that, the number of units coming in is not going to filter down to $800 per unit anytime soon.
Mm-hmm. Chris Perry, did you have a question you wanted to ask or comment? You're on mute. I'll give you 2 more seconds to get off mute, and we're going to move on. Folks, is there any other questions in the chat for Mr. Bodakin?
Like I said, there were.
Yeah, I've got one.
Hang on, here he is.
Sorry, yeah. Mr. Bodakin, or Professor Bodakin, I've got a question about how we pay for aging housing. We've oftentimes gotten into a quandary about whether we can pay for housing, aging HVAC, infrastructure, by raising rent, a modest amount, or by flipping the property to a new management company, which, in my observation and experience, happens all too frequently. Mm-hmm. With a new property management company comes turmoil. Could you talk about that?
Well, I don't have a particular view on particular aging of properties. I will say that my organization worked on aging properties. We used a lot of subsidies and funding from the federal government and others to rehabilitate those properties. But in the private market, Chris, you're quite right that there are some improvements that where it's hard to charge more rent for. Here's a good example. I have a roof that's a problem. If I put on a new roof, it's hard to charge more rent for that property. People aren't going to say, oh gosh, if you have a new roof, I'm going to pay more rent. Whereas if you do a new kitchen, right, and nicer appliances, people might say, well, I'll pay more rent for that. So there are certain costs for improvements that are harder to use as a means for paying more rent. Rent stabilization in some ways helps rationalize those differences, because rent stabilization says the cost for the roof is the same for the cost for the new refrigerator. You're going to get the same return, so to speak, whether you put it on the roof or the refrigerator. And so you're not having that incentive to put in new kitchens rather than a new roof. And so that's the point really of rent stabilization, is to provide a fair profit overall. So you're not gaming the system trying to figure out a way to charge more rents for X, not Y. I hope that answered the question.
One of the came up quickly about Mount Rainier and Prince George's County. They just passed rent stabilization. There's really no way to analyze it yet. They just passed it. I will say the Prince George's bill, which limits rents to 3%, is only for 1 year. And so it has a different dynamic, since we won't be able to evaluate it longitudinally unless they reenact it again in the next year. I will say that when Montgomery County enacted the emergency rent cap during COVID, the sky did not fall, and the rental housing continued to make money, and people are doing okay. And what it did, unfortunately, do is give the landlords a great incentive to gouge as soon as it was lifted. And that is what we are seeing now, which is terribly irresponsible. I think that might be it for now. Yes, I believe so. Is there anything else, staff, for Mr. Badakian?
Again, there were just a couple questions about the specifics of the bills, but that might not be, we could probably iron those out when. Sorry, Pat.
No, I was gonna say, we had a couple questions about rental assistance for Montgomery County, and I was gonna ask Nicole to kind of address those two.
Okay, well, when we get to
About-
Nicole, we'll get
About
to those
what was
questions. That'll be good. Okay, well, I think that is a fantastic summary. And we are really grateful to you and your expertise. Mr. Badakian, again, an adjunct professor, a lawyer, former deputy mayor of the city of Los Angeles, and so many other titles. We have found you, and not only that, you live right here in Montgomery County. You're a resident. So you're our local expert, and we very much appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing more from you. I will say to our good friends out at the Affordable Housing Conference, they are having their conference on May 5th, which we will be attending. Our board chair, William Roberts, will be a participant in one of the panels on rent stabilization, and congratulations to the Affordable Housing Conference for including that kind of discussion in the conference. We think it'll be very productive and valuable for everybody who participates. Again, May 5th. If you're into the housing thing, that's the place to be on May 5th. We are going to be monitoring what's happening. Again, we will have an ongoing dialogue. We expect to have another community forum with others from the council. We have only had one discussion with the folks from the anti-rent gouging bill. That was Council Member Natalie Fanny Gonzalez, who came on and gave her perspective and also said the door was wide open for amendments and other considerations. We have had a forum with County Executive Mark Elridge and Will Jawando and also Professor Badakian that was televised and is still available on YouTube if you want to hear that discussion. And we are going to press as best we can the other members of the council, including the other co-sponsor for the anti-rent gouging bill, Council Member Andrew Friedson, and some of the other council members who really haven't come out and given their perspectives on their considerations. So stay tuned to that. This is extremely important. We have nearly 40% of Montgomery County living in rental housing. That's, we're talking about nearly 400,000 of our residents. This is not small potatoes anymore. This is not a house and garden community outside of Washington, D.C. that it may have been back in the 1950s. If we look around, Bethesda, Silver Spring, Rockville are small cities, and they're all in Montgomery County. We have a stake in stable, affordable housing, more so now than ever in our history. And thankfully, thanks to people like Professor Badakian and council members who have been interested in this, and County Executive Elridge, who's been a champion of renters' rights and stable housing for as long as we've known him. And unfortunately, there being a housing crisis, attention is being put on this public policy issue in an unprecedented way. But that doesn't mean that each one of us can sit back and watch. We have to be participants. So we understand that from Council President Glass that this bill will go to the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee on June 15th. But between now and then, we hope everybody is contacting their council members, expressing their viewpoints, and participating in these public dialogues and giving your opinions and doing your homework so that we don't have, part of the argument in Crazyville, because there's too much of that out there enough. So with that, Professor, lawyer, deputy mayor, and our friend, Mr. Badakian, we thank you very much for participating tonight. You're welcome to hang around and listen to us kibitz on these other things, but we want to say thanks.
Thank you. And I should have mentioned I've been in Montgomery County for 30 years. I think I'm going to stay.
Okay, well, that's good to know. All right, with that, then let us move on to the next issue before Senator Hedelman, who will be joining us later in the conversation to talk about her sponsorship of the licensing bill that passed the House and the Senate in Maryland legislature and now awaits the governor's signature. We'll wait for Senator Hedelman down the road. But with us now is the manager of the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, Nicole Katravanos. And I think, is Kashamba also with us? I see a telephone number there, but I'm not sure if that's who that is. But we can start with Nicole and see what happens. Nicole, you're on mute.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everybody. Matt, feel free to interrupt me at any time if Kashamba does arrive or if we need to go to the next speaker. So good evening, everybody. Happy to be here as always. I basically am going to be here tonight just to give you a few reminders that I think it's important for tenants specifically to keep in mind these next few months and to answer any questions that you may have, and to just review the application process to receive services from DHCA. And I just received a message from Kashamba. She's on the call via phone, so she is available. So Kashamba, I'll just talk a little bit about the ULTA process to apply for services. And then if you'd like to take the mic, I'll leave it to you for how to apply for services or how to file a complaint with code. And then I can answer any questions and just give some reminders to tenants. As far as filing a complaint with the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs, if you are a tenant and you're having a dispute with your landlord, the first thing that I recommend that you do is that you give us a call or you send us an email letting us know what your dispute is, and we can kind of orient you as to what the law is and how it applies to your fact pattern. If at that point you believe that you need to escalate the situation and file a complaint with our office, you can do that. You can email us at ulta.intake@montgomerycountymd.gov to get a copy of the complaint, or you can go onto the DHCA website under the Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs page, and we have a complaint that can be downloaded and then filled out. If you choose to file a complaint, I ask that you please fill it out thoroughly and that you attach any pertinent documents. Always attach a copy of your lease and any other documentation that you think is relevant for the investigation of your case. Once your complaint has been received by our office, I will then review it. I'll assign it to an investigator. You will receive a confirmation letter from our office letting you know that we received your complaint and the contact information and name of the investigator assigned to your case. At that point, the investigator will reach out to yourself and to the landlord to gather information, to ask questions, and then a mediation date can be scheduled to see if there can be an amicable resolution to the dispute. If the mediation is fruitful, the investigator will then move forward to draft a consent agreement, which both parties will sign. I will typically sign it myself, and the office has the ability to enforce that consent agreement. If the mediation is not fruitful at that point, the investigator can refer the case to our commission, which is the Commission of Landlord Tenant Affairs, that's made up of volunteers within the community. And the commission will decide at our monthly hearings if they will take jurisdiction of the case. If they do, then a hearing date will be scheduled. All parties will be notified, and tenants can decide if they want to participate at the hearing pro se, meaning without an attorney present, or if they want to hire an attorney. We also have pamphlets to guide tenants who are unable to hire an attorney, to let them know what that hearing process is going to look like, how to best prepare, and you can always contact the investigator with any questions that you may have to help you in that process. All our hearings are conducted via Zoom. They're done online. And they're made it's a forum that is friendly to individuals who don't have attorneys, and there's no fees associated with filing a complaint or having a hearing either. Once a hearing is held, the panel of the commission issues a decision and order, and there's always the option of appealing that decision and order to the circuit court. So that's the process of filing a complaint with ULTA. If you have general questions, you can call 311, and our investigators call back within 24 to 48 hours. You can also email us at ulta.intake@montgomerycountymd.gov. We respond to emails within 24 and 48 hours. And you're always welcome to walk into our office on the 4th floor of our building located at 1401 Rockville Pike. However, for those that would like to come in person, I just want to let you know that at times we do have long waits because we don't ensure availability from an investigator immediately. But I understand that for some people that is ideal. And if you do come in person, always bring documentation with you as well. As far as the subject matters, just please ensure that you are located in our jurisdiction. So we do not take complaints for properties located in the city of Rockville, the city of Gaithersburg, or Tacoma Park. And many times tenants have issues that are maintenance issues, and those are typically complaints that need to be filed with code. So I will give the mic over to Kashamba so she can talk a little bit about what the complaint process is.
But before you go, Nicole, don't go so quick, come back. A couple things, just for folks, because we hear this all the time. Renters Alliance works closely with the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs, since we know the ups and downs. There was a period where there were some delays in dealing with cases. And have you guys gotten back to the 48 hours response time?
Our response time to service requests, which are done via phone and via email, have always maintained itself within 48 hours. Even at our most challenging times. However, we did have and continue to have delays with the complaint process. So our notification letters confirming that we have received your complaint with the information of your assigned investigator is going out within 2 weeks. However, as to when a mediation date will be scheduled, that is still a bit of a lengthy process. So if a tenant, I always encourage tenants, if it's an emergency situation, to reach out and see, especially in situations where a tenant has been illegally locked out of their property, illegally evicted from their property without a judgment from court. Please contact our office. I will prioritize that. You will not have to go through the complaint process. But it is worth tenants making an assessment as to what venue is the best place for them to take their dispute, whether it's the court, the district court, whether it's our office, whether it's the county attorney's office, whether it's free mediation services that are offered by different conflict resolution centers that I know that Montgomery County Conflict Resolution, CMCR, can usually schedule a mediation within a week's time, which is much more expedient than we do, but they don't have the ability to enforce any potential consent agreements. So you can always give us a call and we can talk through your specific situation to let you know, to kind of help you with that decision making as to what is best for you.
And also, before we jump to Kashamba, who we're delighted to have with us, can you give us some of the top kinds of complaints that you see, Nicole, that your office can resolve?
Sure. The majority of the complaints that we receive are security deposit complaints, where a tenant has moved out and the landlord has not provided a list of this, he has not provided this, returned the security deposit within 45 days or provided a list with the cost incurred and taking out of that security deposit. That's our number one. We do receive a lot of complaints regarding requests for reduction of rent or changes to leases as a result of code enforcement violations or reduction of services. And we have recently received a lot of complaints and inquiries regarding additional fees that tenants have been receiving in addition to their rent. A few things that I wanted just to put on everybody's radar is that, you know, the summer months are coming. Our spring has been a bit unpredictable. We've had some really, really warm days. And the law does not require for the landlords to turn on the air conditioning until June 1st. At that point, from June 1st until September 30th, the landlords are required to have air conditioning units that work and that will maintain the temperature not more than 80 degrees. That said, if you're a tenant and you know that your air conditioning unit is not in working order, even though it's not June 1st, you can contact code and report that so that it can be repaired. Also, I know we've discussed this in the past, but starting July 1st, the radon bill will take effect, which means that if you have a rental unit on a basement, in the basement or on the ground floor, and if you as a tenant want to take the initiative of conducting a radon test, you can go onto the DEP website. They have a link for home kits that they recommend that are basically vouched and approved by them. And you can do the test at home. You can give us a call as to get more details as to what the requirements are. If the result of the radon test is above a certain amount, then you can inform your landlord, and your landlord is obliged to remediate that, or to remediate it and lower it to a certain amount. And then if it doesn't get lowered within a certain time period, the tenant has the right to end their lease without penalty. And just always a reminder, it's so important for tenants to be proactive with renters insurance. Unfortunately, the past year that I've been at the HCA, the number of devastating fires and floodings that has resulted in so many tenants being displaced has just been incredibly high. And there is no law that requires tenants to have renters insurance. There are times where landlords will include a clause in their contract and their leases requiring tenants to have renters insurance, but many times that requirement isn't an insurance that necessarily protects the tenant. Rather, many times it just protects the landlord. So review your leases, see what you've signed. If there is a tenant, if there's a insurance requirement, see what it is that you have paid for. And if you don't have protection, please look into that. You can contact us and we can give you information as to where you can obtain owner's insurance.
I will say, I see the question in the chat. Retaliation is illegal in Montgomery County. If you have evidence that you're being retaliated against, you can contact, of course, the Renters Alliance at any time and the Office of Landlord and Tenant Affairs. And because we have Senator Hettleman with us right now, I want to move along a little bit. But quickly, we are asking people who are seeing excessive rent increases to please contact the Office of the Landlord and Tenant Affairs to let them know about those increases. If you've got an increase of over 5%, 6%, 8%, or in the double digits, please send the renewal notice to ulta.intake@montgomerycountymd.org so that they can keep track of this in order to inform the county council about the kinds of examples of excessive rent increases we're seeing throughout the county. Also, renewal notices have requirements. They have to include certain elements, including offering you a 2-year lease and being 90 days prospective. If you've got a renewal notice that doesn't include these elements, let us know because the landlord will have to go back to zero again, start over again, and give you another renewal notice that is 90 days prospective. So Nicole, do you want to introduce your colleague?
Absolutely. Kashamba Williams, and she works at the Office of Code Enforcement here at the HCA.
You are on mute, Kashamba. And you're still on mute. If that's you.
Sometimes there's a phone mute and a *6 unmute to do.
There she is.
There you go.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kashamba Williams. I am a program manager for the multifamily division with the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, Code Enforcement. And so this evening, I will just go through the process, if that's okay, to file a complaint against your landlord if there are any issues or concerns in your home that relate to maintenance. So Code Enforcement, the inspectors are pretty much neutral to the landlord and neutral to the resident. Just we are here to preserve the stock of housing and apartments here in Montgomery County to make sure that they're up to code compliance. If there's an issue, we do ask that you first, try to make sure that you contact your management team and give them the time to come out to correct any violations or any maintenance that's in your home. If they have not corrected the maintenance or you have issues that are ongoing, you can contact 311 and request for a code enforcement officer to come to do an inspection to see if there are any visible code violations. When the inspector does come out, they will check things and to ensure your home is in code compliance. If it is not, a violation will be generated and essentially given the property management company a time frame in which to resolve. So if they don't resolve it in that time frame, then the inspector can come back out, he'll reinspect or she'll reinspect, and they can issue a notice of violation 2 and or just go to the citation phase. And so with the citation, we file for court to ensure that the landlord is going to get the maintenance concerns addressed. If they do not get them addressed, we can impose fines against the landlord until they are addressed, and or if they get them resolved, then we can close the case, but we can still impose fines. If they do not, we will ask the judge, the courts, for an abatement so that we can have that and still impose those fines, get those issues resolved. But not only that, there's a 10-year abatement on that in order to ensure that this does not reoccur.
Very good. Thank you, Kashamba. And Kashamba, we always do this to people who come on our town halls. Now that we know who you are, we're never going to let you get away. So we will have you come back to one of our upcoming town halls again, hopefully, so we can pick your brains on code enforcement issues and allow renters the opportunity to raise questions and concerns with you when we have more time. But thank you for coming.
Sure.
And welcome to Montgomery County's Code Department.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Okay. So without further, and thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Kashamba. Without further ado, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce a great friend of renters' rights, a champion in Annapolis, someone that we have worked closely with on many issues, but particularly one that, and this being unfortunately somewhat rare in Annapolis, but one that has been successful. And that is for Senate Bill 100, which would allow or require landlords to be licensed before they can pursue eviction. Senator Shelley Hettleman represents District 11 in Baltimore County. And again, she has just been the leader on this bill for, I guess, over a couple of years now. And finally, the bill, I think, has gotten through the House and the Senate and is awaiting the governor's signature. So with that, please tell us about the bill, Senator, and let us ask you some questions.
Sure. Thank you very much, Matt. Thanks for having me. And you guys have been partners from the very beginning. So I really appreciate all of your work and hard work to make this happen. I will say it did pass the General Assembly last year, and then it was vetoed by Governor Hogan. So that was that was a rough one. But we're very happy. The bill is somewhat different this year. There were some landlord issues that were brought up at the 11th hour, literally like right before it was about to pass the second body last year. And I think they got to the governor, they got his ear. So that's why I think vetoed it. So what the bill does is I'll give you a little history. Back in 2011, there was a case, McDaniel versus Baranowski. And what the court said at that time was that was a failure to pay rent case. And it said in order for somebody a landlord to be able to evict you for failure to pay rent, they had to be in compliance with local licensure laws. So not every jurisdiction in our state requires landlords to be licensed, but for those that do, you need to follow the law if you want to use the law to evict somebody. And that had been in the case for 10 years until 2021. There was a case in December of 2021 called Veliky versus Copycat. And what that court said was it really kind of their logic flew in the face of the Baranowski logic. And what they said is that a landlord didn't have to be licensed in order to pursue a tenant holding over action. And I thought that I read about the case in the paper, and I thought it was really making a mockery of our local jurisdictions' real estate licensing laws. Those are meant to be a floor, not a ceiling, right? To provide certain measure of public health and safety. And I just thought it was really wrong that if a landlord was going to use the legal system, then they should be in compliance with the legal system. And so I worked with with Mary Lehman, who is a delegate from Prince George's County. She had been looking at this as a local bill for a number of years, just focused on Prince George's County. And I talked with her and talked with her about this case in 2021, and we decided to go for making it a statewide bill and including all types, putting into law also the failure to pay rent circumstance, so that it wouldn't just be, based on the court decision, but really putting it into statute. And so we finally came up with a consensus bill after many weeks this year, working with the landlords, working with the landlords' very active and powerful lobbies in Annapolis.
I don't believe it.
AOBA and MMHA, working with them and working with my colleagues, and all stakeholders finally came to consensus on a bill. And that is, as you said, Matt, Senate Bill 100, House Bill 36, and both passed. And it says in all three filings, tenant holding over, breach of lease, and failure to pay rent, that you need to be in compliance. There are a couple of sort of safety valves if there is the fault of the tenant, that they're out of compliance. If there's an administrative error, for example, from the licensing agency, if their error or omission causes the landlord to be out of compliance, then that's sort of an escape valve. And then if the landlord has taken all the necessary steps to become licensed and the unit subject to the eviction is free from major defects, but the landlord of a multi-unit property is unable to get a license because of a condition of disrepair of another unit that's unrelated, then that will still allow them to move forward. So it was a delicate balancing act. There was a lot of focus literally on individual words, more so than any other. I've been doing this for a while now, but more so a lot of word haggling. But we finally got there and finally got it over the finish line. And I'm looking forward to the governor signing it into law in the next couple of weeks.
I don't think our people, this, Senator Hedelman, but I don't think most renters, or for that matter, most residents of the state of Maryland, understand the arduous journey of getting this kind of legislation passed. And I think our good friend Lisa Sorrows out there sending her best regards because she understands how difficult
she was there
this is
too,
all the way.
Fighting. She was amazing. She was there testifying and, being our Anne Arundel person. She really was really helpful.
She's terrific.
And
a lawyer, but it must be because the bill was so impactful that it got the fullest attention of a multi-billion-dollar industry's concern to even get down to the words, one at a time words. That's how important this bill was, even though, as you say, it's a common sense bill. You'd think that, if you're going to be able to use the law to enforce, your rights, that you ought to be in compliance with the law. Gee, that makes sense. It's, as I mentioned to Professor Bodakin earlier, dealing with common sense and facts these days, it seems so unusual and so incredibly soothing to hear it. So we are delighted. Now, as I say, it got through the House and Senate last year and got to Governor Hogan's desk and was vetoed. I don't think we can say that enough as a reminder of how perilous these journeys can be. But thanks to your leadership, you got it through, and with your colleagues and with the support of scores of community organizations, including the Renters Alliance, thousands of renters. It may not protect everyone, but it will protect hundreds of thousands of renters who are protected by this from failure to pay rent, tenant holding over, or breach of lease if the landlord is not in compliance. And some of those stories are really tragic, where renters have been pursuing promised or required services or their rights, and in some ways just being retaliated against by a landlord who's not complying with the law. So I don't think we can say thank you enough, Senator Hellerman, but we all do want to know when the signing is going to be and when the party is going to be.
Well, I don't know. I will let you know. I think this governor has given us a little more time and a little more notice than that morning or the night before for his bill signing. So I will let you know. We'll be sure to let you know when we find out too. I will say, I don't think that, and I said this all along, landlords who are responsible landlords have absolutely nothing to fear from this bill, right? And that's what I just didn't get all of the attention. And I know each jurisdiction's licensing laws are different. Some apply to individual units, some apply to big, buildings. And so that's where it got challenging, is because each jurisdiction does it differently. But I will be sure to let you know when we hear about a bill signing. Yes, would love to celebrate, and just thank you. I'm sure a lot of people on this Zoom who had a lot to do with letting their legislators know that this was an important bill. And this landlord-tenant bills are really challenging. I have learned over the past 3 years since I really kind of dug in on them. They're really challenging in Annapolis.
Well, sadly, unfortunately, except for this bill and an extension or confirmation of the right to counsel funding this year, I don't think anything passed for protections, to advance protections for renters. So you're the star this time around.
Well, I will say, COVID was a really, really challenging time, but one of the wonderful things that we got out of COVID, and I think we would not have gotten it but for it, was the access to counsel bill, which was my bill and Delegate Fisher's bill from Prince George's County, ensuring that people will have access to counsel when they face eviction, because we all know that can make a huge, huge difference as to whether someone can stay housed or not.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
I see a question. I think you said this, Senator, but if it does cover tenant holding over.
Yes, it does.
So tenant holding over, for those who don't know what that is, if a landlord says that we're going to repossess the property at the end of your lease, you have to move out, and they give you 60 days notice, which unfortunately in the state of Maryland is still legal. Renters Alliance and others have been fighting for years to enact just cause legal protection that would require a landlord to state a justifiable reason not to renew a lease. But right now, they can say with 60 days notice, without having to provide justification, that they're not going to renew the lease. If you stay 1 day longer than the lease, you are what's known as tenant holding over. And the landlord can file in court for tenant holding over to have you evicted. However, thanks to Senator Shelley Hellerman, this law says you better be licensed in order to do that. Is that about right? Okay.
And then can I throw in from earlier, just because we had the question of the county bills, the stabilization bills, whether either of those had that protection you just described, the just cause. I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that no, that would have to be a state thing like Matt just described. So neither of those bills does.
Right. So do we have any other questions for Senator Hedelman, who is coming to us all the way from Baltimore? All right, well, with that, we thank you very much. We look forward to your leadership continuing in Annapolis. As I say, we cannot thank you enough for your leadership on this bill. It's a common sense bill, but it's going to make a whole lot of difference in terms of rental housing justice in our state.
Thank you. Thank you again for all of your work and everything you do.
All right, thank you,
People
Senator.
housed. Take care. Be well.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Everybody, is there anything else that we need to discuss tonight?
A question just popped up if there's any defense to a tenant holdover. And I think I just want to highlight I think the retaliation came up earlier. If a landlord's retaliating against someone for things they're allowed to do, like complaints they're allowed to make, there would be a defense in those cases, certainly, but they don't have to give a reason to not renew a lease, is what Matt was saying.
But let's dive into that just a little bit so people understand. The problem with not having a just cause law that protects renters that would require the landlord to state the reason that they're not going to renew the lease. Otherwise, where there is just cause protection, the lease automatically renews absent a just cause not to. So right now, they don't have to state a reason. They simply have to give you 60 days notice. And if you stay longer, they'll take you to court. And the judge will only ask, did you get 60 days notice? Yes. Now, it is illegal to retaliate. Their retaliation protections in different parts of the state are different. But in Montgomery County, across the board, you cannot retaliate against a tenant. That said, how are you going to prove that? If the landlord doesn't have to state the reason, then you have to have evidence. And you may know that it's because of the color of your skin. You may know it's because you have pursued, promised, or required services, or tried to set up a tenants association, or you complained that your rent was excessive. And you may really believe, and you may be right, that that's the motivation. But since you have no evidence other than your say-so, unless you have an email that says we're going to get rid of this person because they wanted to form a tenants association, or they've said it in front of witnesses, or some other evidence that could be presented in court, it's very, very difficult to defend against a tenant holding over action, which is why we're so strongly in support of just cause eviction protection. Our board member, Delegate Janelle Wilkins, has put forward legislation each year. It has gotten more and more support each year. This year, again, it has the support of, even though this doesn't have any legislative force, but we did have the full support of the Montgomery County Council. We have the support of the county executive and the vast majority of the county delegation to Annapolis, the state legislators and senators. They're all in support of it. Problem is, it has to be enacted in Annapolis. The chair of the Housing Committee, Delegate Kumar Barve, who also happens to be from Montgomery County, has adamantly opposed it for reasons we have never really fully understood. I can say that the news is that Delegate Barve, who's chaired that committee, will no longer chair that committee next year, is moving on to another position. And so we'll see whether the next chair of that committee is a little bit more amenable to this discussion. But the fact is, as Senator Hedelman pointed out, moving this legislation through Annapolis is a challenge. And even though there's unprecedented support for renters' rights in the state of Maryland is still culturally far behind, legally far behind what is necessary to enact this legislation. So again, It requires all of you to not just participate in your local politics and understand what your local elected officials are saying and thinking and influence that thinking, but it also requires us to participate in statewide efforts to pass legislation that protects all of us. Any other questions, folks?
Matt, before we get off, I'd like to let everyone know that the state of Maryland is providing $1,000 tax credit to those people who qualify. I put the chat address, the address in the chat section. I think I know the program ends October the 1st. The amount is $1,000 and you may be eligible. They do have certain criteria, but if you go to the address I put in the chat, they'll give you all the information you need. It's for $1,000 and you should apply.
Yeah, you do have to meet eligibility requirements, and thank you for that, Pat. But if you do qualify, it's $1,000 just sitting there.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's for low-income renters, but $1,000 is $1,000, and Lord knows that helps. So if you are eligible, please take advantage of that. I see some folks with their hands raised among the attendees. If you have a question or concerns, please put it in the chat. We're going to be done at 8:30, so put those questions in now and let's make sure that we get to them. David?
Following up on what Pat just said, I mean, there were questions about general kind of rent relief questions earlier too, and I did want to throw out that one announcement I wanted to make is that, you know, the COVID rent relief program is closed for the county. I'm sorry, I think I paused there. It's closed for the county now, but if your landlord is HOC, the Housing Opportunities Commission, or the Montgomery Housing Partnership, you actually may qualify for, and there is still rent relief available. So please do contact us if you live at a property with one of those landlords, because there's currently rent relief, a new phase.
Yeah, or even just dial 311 to the county, and they have different buckets of money, and someone should be able to direct you to rental assistance for your particular problem.
Also bear in mind that, if you're caught up with your rent, and you think that you're being evicted through tenant holding over because you received subsidies from the county, that's against the law. So contact us and let's take a look at that and see whether or not you have a case. We passed with Senator Hettleman and others. It took us 10 years to get it passed, but it's against the law to retaliate or discriminate against a tenant based on their source of income. So there may be other reasons if you're not able to pay your rent, or you're breaking the rules of the lease or of the community property, that a landlord could justifiably evict somebody for, but they can't if the reason is that you received a subsidy or that you were on a voucher or some other source of income. They can't do that. All right.
Pardon me, Matt. Pat, one of our attendees is requesting that you post the link to the funds that you were speaking about in the chat.
To the tax credit program.
I
Can you repost that, please?
Posted it. It's in the chat.
Okay, thank
Go
you.
ahead and post it one more time, just so that it's at the bottom so people can find it if you can, or one of the folks, please do that. Senator Delegate Barve resigned, or is resigning from the state delegation to take a position elsewhere. So he will not moving to another committee. He is moving out. So we will see what the opportunity in the Housing Committee, which is the Environment and Transportation Committee of the House of Delegates, looks like next year. Anything else?
Mr. Bodakin, oddly enough, addressed some of his concerns, if I remember, tonight that Delegate Barbe had. But the other thing, there was something earlier just that someone asked if the rent relief connected to the anti-gouging bill would offset to the point or would equal out to the point where the lower cap on the Home Act where it would kind of equal out. Someone asked that question toward the beginning. I didn't know if I could offer a couple comments, or I don't know if you had any comments on that, Matt or anyone else.
I know that there isn't going to be enough rent relief available to keep enough people stable in their homes without rent stabilization. Rent stabilization, rent relief is a Band-Aid, and some people need a Band-Aid. It might be a tourniquet for some people, but that's all it is. It gives you a momentary relief against a sudden loss of ability to pay rent. Rent stabilization is for the long term to ensure that your housing is stable year in and year out, and that your housing costs are predictable. So with that, if you have any other questions or concerns, you can always contact us at info@rentersalliance.org. Our next Renter Town Hall will be on May 3rd. We will continue the dialogue on rent stabilization and other issues as they come to our attention. We are the Montgomery County Renters Alliance. This is what we do. We talk about renter issues and we help renters in disputes with their landlords. We help them be educated about their rights. We form tenants associations. Contact us for that. And we are always eager to provide information with our outreach tables and information tables. If you've got an activity or an event, get in touch with us and we'd be happy to arrange something. So with that, thank you to everybody who attended. Thank you to all of our panelists, to my staff, to Professor Michael Bodakin especially, and to State Senator Shelley Heddleman. Thank you.